But suppose you had a dream and you didn't wake up and you couldn't find the separation between that world, the world of the collective unconscious or even the personal unconscious, and this waking world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how we can work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's episode is going to deal with schizophrenia as a condition, as something that somebody has symptoms of, but also our response to it socially and personally, and why it is so many of us become so triggered by schizophrenia. All of this is going to be through the lens of Carl Jung, or of Jungian psychoanalysis, and it's going to be with author and Dr. Eve Maram. As per usual, I have a little overture here that I've written. You can read along to it at jameswjesso.com in the show notes, and it's going to sort of set the stage for the interview today. As a psychedelic podcast, we here at Adventures Through the Mind regularly explore the work of Carl Jung as it applies to both psychotherapy and, in general, to understanding the human mind. This is because Jungian perspectives tend to have a substantial utility in helping make sense of psychedelic experiences specifically, but also expanded states of consciousness generally. Here on the podcast, we have explicitly explored the Jungian perspective on psychedelic integration with Maria Papaspirou back in episode 104, with spiritual crisis and psychosis with Dr. Tim Reed in episode 172, and even on the psychological wounding of men by society way back in episode 75 with James Hollis. Generally, though, Jungian perspectives tend to flow into many of the episodes due to the prevalence of certain Jungian concepts in psychedelic culture, such as archetypes or the shadow. This is going to be one of those explicit Jungian episodes, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to be exploring schizophrenia. Specifically, we're going to be exploring the Schizophrenia Complex as it is presented by our guest, Dr. Eve Maram. Dr. Eve Maram is a clinical and forensic psychologist and a certified Jungian Analyst in private practice in Orange, California. She is a member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and the C.G. Jung Institute of Santa Fe, as well as the International Association for Analytical Psychology. She has authored 2 books, Psychopathy Within, published in 2016, and The Schizophrenia Complex, published in 2022. She has also authored several chapters and articles. Throughout this interview, we talk about Dr. Maram's perspective on schizophrenia from a Jungian framework. We talk about it as a condition wherein the organizing function of the ego is overwhelmed by the turbulent waters of the unconscious, a statement that we'll flush out fully in the interview here. But we also go deep into her model of what she calls the Schizophrenia Complex, which is a bundle of, quote, thoughts and feelings constellated by encounters with what we call schizophrenia for those who experience symptoms and for those others impacted by them, end quote. This is another statement that we will fully flush out throughout the interview. We also explore, what a complex is to sort of set the stage, obviously, for the discussion, as well as the role schizophrenia played in the development of Jung's theories, the vital importance of relationship for those with schizophrenia, but how schizophrenia itself attacks our relatedness, the various ways the schizophrenia complex arises within us and why, pharmaceutical versus non-pharmaceutical treatments for schizophrenia, the changing cultural tides around how medicine perceives the condition schizophrenia. And at the end of the interview, Dr. Maram offers us some practical advice for relating with those who have schizophrenia and schizophrenia symptoms. This is advice for practitioners, advice for loved ones, and even for people with the condition themselves. So that's the overture for this episode, and we're going to get into the interview very shortly. Before we do, I want to give a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon who make this podcast possible, who make my capacity to put the time, energy, and finances into producing this podcast possible, as well as enable me to allocate added time to the development of the ideas and the thinking that informs the sort of guest curation and how I engage with each guest, and even presently helping to enable me to put the time in to write the book that I'm presently writing. So big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube. They give significantly, some of which for a long time. Their names are also in the in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. So thank you so much. If you're finding value in this show, finding value in the work that I am doing, you could consider becoming my patron on Patreon. You can do so by becoming a paid member as a part of my Patreon community. There are a variety of options for you to sign up there, to as little as $2 a month if you like. And there's also the option to just follow me on Patreon if you're already on there without having to pay. And you won't get as much access to certain things that are for patrons only, or paid patrons only, excuse me. But you will get to be in direct contact with me rather than relying on the algorithms to make sure that my content is relevant enough to your sort of hijacked interests to put me in the front of your feed. So please do jump over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso, become a paid patron, or simply follow me as a creator on Patreon. If you don't want to use the Patreon platform, you can follow me on social media. Pretty much all of it is at James W. Jesso, Jesso. I also have a Telegram channel and a newsletter, which is really the best way to stay in contact with me. Details for all of that, the links that is, are in the description to this episode. So that is all for the intro. Here is my interview with Dr. Eve Maram on the Schizophrenia Complex in the Turbulent Waters of the Unconscious, episode 181. Enjoy. Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. Dr. Eve Maram, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me.
So for this episode today, I'm feeling very excited to dive into the content of your book, The Schizophrenia Complex, or is it pronounced schizophrenia? I don't know. How do you pronounce it?
I pronounce it schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia. Okay. So the Schizophrenia Complex. And before we get into the actual sort of like depth of the conceptual element of the book, I want to start with getting a sense of, what got you into this content, or like got you onto this topic with respect to your personal story. And I don't want to go too deep in your personal story because I want to explore the content, but maybe you can give us a rundown of how, as a clinical, a forensic psychologist and Jungian, you ended up turning your attention towards schizophrenia.
Okay. Well, I've been a clinical psychologist and a therapist for a very long time. I have also done forensic psychology work. I have also always been interested in Jung and have been studying him for probably now close to 40 years. I became an analyst more recently than that. And what got me into this topic was that I felt thrust into it. As I say in the book, it's not a topic I would have chosen. And quite often, I think our journeys toward individuation, if you will, come unchosen. They come in a form that we would not pick and probably are unsettled by. And in this case, the fact that I had a background in psychology and certainly in with Jung was part of how I arrived at this concept of the schizophrenia complex. There's more about how this occurred in the book, but when my son was diagnosed with schizophrenia about 10 years ago now, it was unexpected. He was not a personality where we would have anticipated this coming early on. It rattled our family to the core, and the conviction I had when we were confronted with this was that I would deal with it with as much curiosity, insight, and love as I possibly could. Because despite how terribly uncomfortable and challenging the shift in our reality was, everything about my background as a Jungian and my personal belief system led me to try and handle this turn of events in a way that could be meaningful and that held love or eros as primary. And I do talk about that in the book. Now, that being said, and I appreciate your saying that even though we touch on the personal, that's not necessarily where we want to dwell or I want to dwell in this interview. I do mention it in the book because I think fundamentally the things that we end up diving into academically, professionally, have everything to do with our personal experience, with our interior life, with who we are in the world personally and individually. There's no such thing as coincidence, as Jung said. There's a synchronicity to what we find ourselves engaged with. And a lot of recognizing that has to do with just what we pay attention to. In the process of dealing with this turn of events with my son, it came to light in ways that I never really knew before that there had been someone with schizophrenia on my mother's side. She had a sister who had the condition, or what we call schizophrenia. And I was not privy to that information or anything about that family history because my mother kept it from me, and intentionally, and to protect me. And the generation that she was from, and it was I say this in a book, so I'm not sharing anything different. It was basically a Swedish community on the East Coast where, of course, there was no therapy. There was shame and fear and a sense of stigma associated with this condition. And so that constellated a whole series of emotional and psychological responses in my mother, which she didn't share with me directly. But then once I had the experience of dealing with my son, I began to connect dots that, this is part of my history. It's showing up, and here's an opportunity for me to deal with it in a different way. So, long-winded answer. Yeah.
No, it was good. And I like this too, because I feel like topics and content and objects of focus just detach from the personal story and the sort of the sense of why it is one cares about these things at all.
Right.
It has a certain degree of interest, but it definitely, has a certain degree of allure. But having an understanding of how and why it is that somebody is really called to something as their object of focus or inquiry or study, it helps us stay connected with the person of the work, rather than just the sort of the consequences or the output of cognitive processes around a center of content.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's how I approach my work. I mean, it certainly has to have an academic component,
Of course,
but that's not what draws me. That's not my passion. I'm in it because of the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So with that said, let's get on to the academic output. And so we're going to talk about the thesis of your book, or the content of your book, The Schizophrenia Complex. And, you said you're a Jungian analyst, and my listenership, my audience, unless they're listening to this show, this is like their first episode or something, they've been exposed to Jungian ideas previously on the show, either sort of implicitly or something, like kind of woven in because of how much influence it has on the discussion space and the study space around making sense of psychedelic experiences, or explicitly because I have people on who are Jungian. Now, that said, I think it's good to kind of lay the groundwork on certain terms, so that they're kind of disambiguated in advance just in case.
Sure.
And the key term for this discussion, I would say, is complex. So maybe you could clarify that for us. What is a complex?
Well, my go-to condensed answer is that I think of it as kind of a pod of undigested thoughts and feelings. It's at the center of every complex is what we refer to as an archetypal core. And that just means that at the core of it, there is a layer of meaning that is larger than life, that's kind of bigger than the circumstances that perhaps triggered our experience of these thoughts and feelings that usually we found overwhelming. And so there's a certain dissociation from whatever all that is inside us. Now, Jung talked about complexes as feeling toned in general. In other words, there's a lot of affect involved in whatever goes on with the complex. To create an example, say somebody, most all of us have some form of, say, a mother complex. And so the emotional experience that we had with our mothers, let's say, perhaps at one point in our lives we found overwhelming or potentially overwhelming. So it really impacted us. And we have never really been able or willing to think our way through it. That's the other thing, is that when you're in that kind of an emotional experience, a complex, then you can't think clearly. That's how those two things are connected. So if you're in the grips of, say, a mother complex, and your girlfriend or your wife does something that reminds you of her, let's say, you might have a very intense reaction you didn't even anticipate. Well, that might be what it looks like when you are in your mother complex, as to give sort of an image of it. That being said, Jung's idea about a schizophrenia complex, and I know you asked me just what a complex is, but I'm going to kind of link it to our topic here.
Yeah.
So Jung's idea about a schizophrenia complex was different from mine, because he worked beautifully with schizophrenia. He saw a schizophrenia complex as being really polarized, cut off, disconnected from a person's affective experience, whereas a schizophrenia complex, the way I'm referring to it, is more like his general description of a feeling-toned complex. In that, I'm saying, okay, we individually, with people we know, and collectively have an emotional response to encounters with what we call schizophrenia, which is many different things. And they tend to form what I'm referring to as a complex. They are feeling toned. They are often reflective of a larger than life terror of the unconscious. I'm throwing in another thingy here, but hopefully that flows with the rest of what I'm saying. Okay. The other way in which my definition of a schizophrenia complex is different from Jung's is that I do think, and I talk about the schizophrenia complex as being something that someone who has had the symptoms or who has the symptoms can also have once they have enough ego consciousness to have some feelings about what they've been through. So somebody, let's say, has a psychotic break and then not a voluntary one, and then they come to and they realize, oh my God, people are looking at me, so I'm so weird. And I've lost these loving connections with my family. People on the street are looking at me weirdly. I mean, so how do they feel? They feel shame. They feel worry. They may distance themselves. They may retreat back into the world of the collective unconscious because it's so painful to realize what they've been going through. Okay, so that, in my way of defining a schizophrenia complex, is also fitting that term. Yeah.
So what you're clarifying here is that Jung saw a schizophrenia complex as a condition that arises as a consequence of a complex being activated that is so detached from the sort of normal baseline operations of human life that it produces a kind of the schizophrenic episode. And your definition is more that it's the response. I mean, I'll clarify this, but the response other people have when they are, in response to the presence of schizophrenia in others, or the presence of schizophrenia in themselves when they're clear enough to recognize that it's alive in them. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it is. I would just okay. That's good. We'll leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to recognize that there's a difference in the definitions as Jung described it and mine, and that mine really is not about schizophrenia itself viewed as a complex. No. His, the way Jung described schizophrenia itself described as a complex. That would be how he wrote about it, described it. And my perspective on this is that the complex I'm describing is not about schizophrenia itself per se, but about the thoughts and feelings that are generated by an encounter with it. So if you think that could be, we encounter somebody on the street and we have that feeling and it floods us with affect, or like you pointed out, it could be the person. I'm glad that you reflected that back, because that's an important part of what I've written about, is that once someone who has these symptoms is able to retrieve their lost affect, they have all those feelings too. So different. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you can give us a better sense of what the schizophrenia complex, as you describe it, is, where it's coming from and what it's a response to. And I think what would help, for me, what I think would help would clarify that is, you've identified how Jung held schizophrenia and that you don't hold it in that way. But how would you describe what schizophrenia is? Because in reading your book, it seemed clear that having an understanding of, at least to the best of our interpretation at this time, what schizophrenia is in relationship to the ego consciousness and the unconscious mind, sort of reveals why it is and what is the deep fear that is being triggered through the schizophrenia complex when someone encounters it in another or in themselves.
That was a lot, and I can't promise you I'm going to track all of it, but I'll pick up what I am hearing and that is striking me as I'm listening to you. I think that, first, to clarify, Jung's work with schizophrenia was absolutely fundamental to the development of his most impactful ideas, such as the archetypes, the collective unconscious. It all came originally from his work at the Berkholtzli, the Psychiatric Institute, with schizophrenic patients. And he was the one, there's an example in the book of this, but there's was a patient there. We call him Solar Phallus Man. And without going into a whole lot of detail, Jung's experience with this patient, he linked what the patient told him with an ancient Mithraic liturgy. He wasn't even into archaeology or mythology at the time he had an encounter with this patient, but years later, he discovers this manuscript and he has an aha moment and goes, "Holy Toledo!" This, not Holy Toledo, if I was Jung, but he had a surprise in that the content of this ancient script was a description of the same image and story that this patient had told him. And he thought, "Oh, goodness." And it helped him to connect the dots that there is a mythological meaning to the hallucinations and delusions associated with what we call schizophrenia. It also helped to sort of normalize what we call schizophrenia at a time when he was writing about this, when, boy, this was radical thinking, because the medical model at that time defined it without this kind of meaning or general application to our human experience. So that part of what Jung believed about and discovered about schizophrenia, I absolutely agree with. My difference with him is in terms of how we use the term schizophrenia complex. Okay, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yes,
okay.
It does. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Now, to the other part that I remember of your question in terms of, what is this thing? I don't know. I don't think any of us know. I think what becomes evident if you really even put a toe into the vast pool of research on this topic is that we just don't really know. We have lots of theories, and many of them have something to offer, but we don't have a clear, specific idea about what we mean when we say schizophrenia, and that's one of the things that makes it so tricky to work with. We have a list of some characteristics, but because individuals who have some of these characteristics also have personalities that have a whole lot of other characteristics, it just doesn't show up the same way in everyone. It makes it harder to recognize. It certainly makes it harder to treat. Okay, so what is schizophrenia? Well, I don't even begin to try and define it in the book. In fact, I make it really clear I'm not going there. This is about the thoughts and feelings generated by an encounter with all the many things we call schizophrenia. It's not an attempt to define this. I do mention some theories because I think that's necessary so that we at least give a nod to this incredible range of ideas we have about this. But the final analysis, at least in my way of perceiving it, is that we need to be open and creative in even our definition of what this is. We need to use all the knowledge we have, which is extensive, but not get locked into, well, this is it, this isn't it, and these are all the things that must be present, and this is how it always must be dealt with. It just isn't that kind of a phenomenon. Now, what I do say about schizophrenia is that in my perception, it has to do with an encounter with the unconscious. So we all have an unconscious. We dream every night, but suppose you had a dream and you didn't wake up and you couldn't find the separation between that world, the world of the collective unconscious or even the personal unconscious, and this waking world. Another image that I describe in the book that I think is important for understanding this perspective is that a person who is having what we call schizophrenia is basically experiencing their unconscious absolutely flooding their ego. So the ego is that driver in the car. It's what we need to take us through the day and navigate life.
Yeah. In the
And
book, you refer to it, I think, as having an organizing function.
yes, big time. Well, think about it. In order we have to have a sense of our ego identity in order to navigate our lives in this world. Okay. Edinger has a wonderful illustration. I put this in the book, and it's in Ego and Archetype. It's on page 5, I think, and he uses it in a different way, but to me, it really spoke to what I perceive happening when a person is in this condition, having this kind of an encounter with the unconscious. Now, there are 3 little diagrams. One of them shows like little snowmen, like 2 balls on top of each other. The first diagram shows the top ball and the bottom ball completely separate from each other. So this would be your ego. The top would be your ego, and the bottom would be the unconscious or the self, right? So complete separation like that, it's not an optimal arrangement. It lacks integration. It doesn't meet the challenge of the totality of our existence. It avoids it, usually not voluntarily. The second diagram shows an overlap so that the ego is able to gradually integrate contents from the unconscious. We need to be able to tap into that resource. But holding on to that organizing function is how we can make sense of it. Okay. The third diagram shows a real immersion of the top ball by the second one. In other words, the ego is submerged in the unconscious. That's what I image as a state of what we call schizophrenia. It's an ego that is flooded by the contents of the unconscious. Okay, so that's an important, I'm hoping that will go out into the world. I mean, I'm not the one who brought it there, but this is how I'm talking about it. Yeah.
It lands for me. I also read your book, but it seems coherent enough if I position myself to someone who hasn't read anything that you've produced yet.
Yeah.
And when you say flood, you use this metaphor quite often in the book, this sort of like the unconscious as a sort of ocean or waters. And I don't know if I'm just literally taking exactly what you said in the book, or if it's some like the image that's prevailing from my interpretations of some of the things talked about. But I was left with this sense of like, okay, so the ego is just doing its best to like keep a nice dry plot and like access the waters as necessary. And that schizophrenia or schizophrenic episodes, they're the consequence of that nice dry plot and whatever sort of retaining walls were set up to ensure that we only have the amount of water that's necessary for creativity and function and so on and so forth. They like break down, and then it is flooded to the point in which that normal organizing function, the operational space of that dry land, is almost completely engulfed. And there's this weird, it's not maybe necessarily actually desperate, but this strange attempt to kind of confine this beyond individual content into an individual frame, and the mind just cannot handle it. The dry land just becomes washed away, and what was once that person is just gone.
Very good.
Did I catch it?
Yeah. Lovely. And I really enjoy how you have put yourself into this, because this is your take on the message of the words. And to me, there's nothing better than that. That means that you've recognized something that has a meaning for you. Yeah, and I appreciate that.
And I did, from my personal experience with journeying with psychedelics, also my own journey of a period of time in my life where I have, in hindsight, realized pretty sure I was in a drug-induced psychosis, but not enough so to totally mess up my life or have the people around me be concerned, because they were also on some level on that level with me. And also from the perspective of having other people in my life who I know are people who have schizophrenia, who are medicated and have had previous encounters with the sort of like I don't know what you would describe it when all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm realizing I have schizophrenia because now I'm coming back to realize that the last like year of my life was a psychotic episode or something to this effect. And others in my world who just have this condition in various sort of like degrees of integration in their regular life and medication, et cetera, and wanting deeply to have an understanding of the condition, not just a them understanding, but an us understanding, so that I can be more caring and sort of catch my own schizophrenia complex. I'll ask you a little bit more about how to be in relationship later on, so I don't want to go there.
Sure.
But this is why I caught, you're saying like, I found a meaning in it. Well, that's why, because it felt like personally relevant to me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And honestly, I think that's generally true, and that's the tricky thing about, the all the information and the knowledge and the academic frame. It has a certain ego appeal, and it helps us to feel safe and like, oh, well, I have the answer here. And so here, let me tell you. And the nature of what we call schizophrenia absolutely defies that. It defies our putting it into a frame like that. We can just be curious and caring and inquisitive, so that the information can serve us, but it can also be a way to avoid just the kind of personal encounter with this challenge that you're describing. Yeah.
So I want to lean a little bit more now onto that. The schizophrenia complex as you describe it. In your book, you write something to the effect, and I don't think this is the only thing you bring up, but it's one that really stuck with me, which is that the complex arises from schizophrenia as a condition, confronting us with the fear of annihilation. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Sure. Well, I think that's another way to say what we've already been describing in terms of this flooding. To use your wonderful image of that dry plot, it's no longer dry. It is we're drowning. We're drowning in the undifferentiated waters of the unconscious. And so to that extent, that is annihilation, isn't it? It's the destruction of everything we hold on to define ourselves as individuals. So I don't know if that answers your question or.
Yeah, I think there's I'm kind of like a grasping at something ambiguous, because I know there's something I'm trying to ask you about, but I don't even entirely know how to get there, which is
that's okay.
Like a little bit more about around like what's happening in the person with the schizophrenia complex when it's arising. Like what is being triggered in them? Why is it coming up? Why is it that what they're encountering might, the different ways. Oh, here's another one, the different ways it might express. Because if we just say fear of total annihilation, that's assuming someone's looking at a schizophrenic person and be like, they represent me completely losing a grasp on my ability to function as a singular ego consciousness. Run away. But it's actually more insidious and dynamic than that. So maybe you could go into a little bit of that.
Well, sure. I think what you just said actually is a pretty good description. The difference would be that when somebody's in a complex, they're not consciously aware of going, ew, I don't want to be like that. Get me away. Instead, they may have a feeling of dread. And okay, I'll give you this. I don't know if this fits. It's an example that I've used a couple of times in talking about this material. This book has a tendency to constellate the very thing it describes. In other words, there are people who are willing to lean into it or are drawn to it and really want to hear about it. And then there are plenty who don't want to have anything to do with it. Okay. So even in my little world, people that I might have anticipated would say, oh, a book. Great. Let's take a look at this. They don't want to, even relatives. So I have a friend of many years, very well educated, but not psychologically oriented in particular. And she tried she's a dear friend, so she tried, and she said, I couldn't read the book. I just started, and it was just she said it was too academic. Well, I don't think so, but I think she just didn't want to take a look. So then she circled back, and she went ahead and she read more of it. And then she read all of it. And then she said, and something interesting happened. I was out and about, and I saw a woman in the street. We've all seen, individuals that we think, something's going on there. They're having, and her typical reaction would have been to avoid, to feel some fear and dread, and to just go to the other side of the street. And instead, she said, I looked at her and I thought to myself, I know what's going on with her. She's having an encounter with her unconscious. So that, to me, is kind of what this is all about, is that her thinking and feeling shifted slightly from avoidance, from stigmatizing, from, really hating, what she was seeing there, to having some understanding of what it might be manifesting. And that's important, not just about, how we treat people that we encounter in the street, of course, or even people in our lives, but the link that I try to draw in the writing is that this is also about our relationship with our own unconscious, which many of us are really challenged by. Uh, it's an aspect of our lives that we really can't control, and as humans, we basically usually really hate that. We like to be able to say, oh, I'm going to make a decision to do this and a decision to do that, and it's going to work. And maybe it won't, but if it doesn't, I can fix it. And this is the answer to that. This is not that kind of phenomenon. So that's where schizophrenia complex, as I'm describing it, is we are seeing in some encounter, perhaps with an other, if it's someone that we know or someone that we don't, and even collectively, there is this response to this form of mental experience, and it's not a welcoming one. There are not resources. There's a reason there. But we try very hard to stay in to feel like we have a sense of control. And when we see in someone beyond us or in an experience beyond us, a manifestation of this, it hits us at that other layer too. We may have a conscious response of, I really don't want to have to deal with this irrational person and cross the street. But what I'm talking about is beyond that. It's the deeper layer of affective experience around this phenomenon. I think it strikes at us in a personal way. Even though we may think what we're doing is avoiding madness out there, it also puts us in touch with our own. And I know you didn't ask this, but boy, I'm really tempted to read this. Can I read a quote from Jung?
Sure, get in there.
Okay. All right, I'm just going to do this because it talks about him and his relationship to madness. Most of us know about the Red Book, so we already know that he's somebody who could visit these far reaches and return to tell about it, which is amazing. Okay, but this is what he wrote in the Red Book about madness. Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are completely mired in madness? Do you not want to recognize your madness and welcome it in a friendly manner? You wanted to accept everything, so accept madness too. Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead you should give it life. If you want to find paths, you should also not spurn madness, since it makes up such a great part of your nature. Be glad that you can recognize it, for you will thus avoid becoming its victim. Madness is a special form of the spirit and clings to all teachings and philosophies, but even more to daily life, since life itself is full of craziness and at bottom utterly illogical. Man strives toward reason only so that he can make rules for himself. Life itself has no rules. That is its mystery and its unknown law. What you call knowledge is an attempt to impose something comprehensible on life. Thank you, Jung.
There's a couple of pieces there. One of which is, I appreciated when you clarified the kind of fear response. I think in the book you refer to it kind of like as a justifiable fear, because
Yeah,
of course you should be afraid of, or of course it's reasonable that you would be afraid of total annihilation of the
right,
thing that allows you to function in baseline reality with
right.
everyone else on the quest to survive for
Yeah,
as long as reasonably possible until our
yeah.
ticket is punched. But what I didn't hear you talking to in there was the sort of the perhaps justifiable fear of not wanting to interact with someone who is clearly out of stability to the point that their instability itself is threatening. And it's actually
Mhm,
fair to be threatened by someone who you
mhm,
have no reason to assume that you might not get pulled into an interaction that could cause you harm emotionally, physically, psychologically.
mhm,
And when you mention, oh, you might want to just not get into an interaction with that person,
mhm,
that's not what you're talking about. I appreciated that clarification because I felt like in the book that wasn't clarified. It was just sort of focusing on the fear as just like a response to our
mhm,
own desire for control.
mhm,
And when you spoke to it here, I was like, oh yeah, because also,
mhm,
it is
mhm.
genuine to be like, and if I don't know this person, so on and so forth,
Right.
I could be non-judgmental and compassionate and also recognize that I don't want to get involved in what's happening because it might very well be presenting a threat to me. Now, this
Sure.
is someone randomly on the street. Perhaps this might be different than a
Mhm.
family member, so on and so forth. So I just wanted
Yeah.
to, point out that I appreciated that.
Good. Well, I'm glad that that resonated for you. Yeah, when you have a reaction that is conscious and deliberate, like what you're describing, certainly you want to avoid situations that could cause harm. And, if a situation is avoidable and it looks undesirable, then an appropriate ego conscious response to it would be to do just that, to do something else. So what I'm talking about, even with the example with my friend, and I'm glad you leaned into this a little bit, is not that that means okay, well then we need to go have conversations when we see somebody, you know, uh, talking to people we can't see. No, this doesn't have to do with what we take on uh, in the moment. Realistically, in terms of our physical reality, what I'm talking about has more to do with the emotional layer. So, and they're different, aren't they? Because I mean, if you have a reaction to somebody who looks like they might be threatening, and your reaction is self-protective and it's rational, and you decide to go to the other side of the street, then good for you, because that's protecting yourself in a healthy way. But what I'm talking about is what goes along with that. Like, is your stomach in knots because you're afraid of whatever that might be? Because that probably talks more to your attitude and your perception about the irrational, about the unconscious. And that's where healthy caution is certainly warranted. Yeah. The justifiable terror I was talking about, and I think you captured that perfectly anyway. But I mean, um, yes, it makes perfect logical sense to be wary of the unconscious. Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So now that said, now I don't know this is confirmed, but I did just literally a couple of days ago read it in another book that I was reading in preparation for an interview from a woman named Rachel Harris. And she was talking about Jung in the Red Book. And actually, there's a big portion of this book is sort of being like, hey, if we look back into the history of these pioneers of psychedelic exploration and explorations of the mind, the courageous ones, such as Jung, obviously brilliant, courageous pioneer, um, other figures as well, we realize, oh, wait, there's also quite often a woman in that story too, who just wasn't written into the history because of a history of sort of like male first dominance, often referred to as the patriarchy. And that there was a woman guide that Jung had in this time,
Salome.
right? Yeah. And the reason I'm pointing that out, bringing that up, other than to draw attention to that whenever it's a reasonable way to bring attention to that sort of the writing of women out of history, is because it sort of points to maybe the necessity or the importance of relational contact in the midst of the journey of someone going through a schizophrenic episode with respect to coming through it in a healthy way or coming through it at all. And this is where like the delta of this idea just really breaks, because there's a number of things that are like, one of which is, okay, so then what does that look like if we're supporting and caring with respect to so on and so forth? Before we go to that, I have two specific questions, which is like, one, I'll just state the first one now. And it is fear being triggered, complex being triggered. Running away from a thing is one way that we respond to things that trigger us. Fighting a thing is another way that we respond. So there might be other ways of fighting, including aggression, blaming, so on and so forth. But there are other ways that we respond to things that are triggering, such as the freeze response. But in particular to my question here is the fawn response. I'm wondering what your take is on the schizophrenia complex manifesting in this sort of like, I can save this person.
Sure. Well, that's a very good point, and you packed a lot into that statement. I want to start, you did mention this idea, you talked about it in terms of female writers, but you mentioned a very important component, at least as I describe it in the book, about how do we navigate this complex phenomenon. And the role of the feminine could be also described as, relatedness and the role of eros or of love in the broader sense. I do think that ultimately that is the redeeming element in terms of our getting through this absolutely challenging aspect of our existence. When we can. Now, schizophrenia, what we call schizophrenia, by definition, attacks relatedness because it takes the individual out of the world that is shared by others that they may be connected with or have been connected with. And that's one of the key aspects of an experience of the schizophrenia complex for family members, for example, because all of a sudden this person that they knew to be a certain way and that they considered themselves to be in a relationship with is no longer available, and they really are not. So I don't think that when somebody is in that world, when they are in a state of immersion in the unconscious, I do not perceive that state as being one where someone is accessible to relationship. They're just not available. And fortunately, this is not an all or nothing thing most of the time. In other words, people, even who are in what we would call a psychotic experience, often have I didn't make this up, but it's in the book, that they have what I call islands of clarity. A colleague of mine came up with that term. In other words, to use your metaphor of the dry sandbar, I mean, it's like they emerge here and there and they show up and you can tell. So I have a couple of descriptions of therapy with individuals who had this diagnosis, and at least one of them, it was my psych assistant who had the direct responsibility for therapy with him, but she said it was like sitting with him and he would fly out the window, and she had to learn to be patient, genuinely patient, not faux patient, but really patient, and wait until he returned. Then when he got back, which he typically did, then you could resume the connection. And I think you're right. Yeah, that's the key. That relationship, caring, that's the feminine guide, and I'm not just talking about a woman, I'm talking about that quality in humans, male and female. That is the essence of what can get us through this muck.
So then what are your thoughts there on my comment about like a fawning response manifesting through a schizophrenia complex, where one would maybe get it in their mind that they're going to be the savior of this person?
No. Well, it becomes a folie à deux. It becomes a sort of a shared schizophrenia complex with the individual. It is often, I mean, and not to stereotype and generalize, but to stereotype and generalize. I mean, let's see, the mother and a child, an adult child usually, who has this condition. And so that's a typical response. And with a lot of things that works. We're just going to, be there, be present, be loving. That ain't going to work because that person is not available for that. So it becomes not only an enabling factor in terms of the condition, because there's also a great deal of denial in that emotional response. It's not a grounded acknowledgement of this individual's situation. In my book, I describe it as being in a great mother complex. That's that attitude of, I can fix this. I can fix anything. I can love it into which is, I don't know if we could say this it's bullshit. That's the clinical term. It's just not real. So that's a manifestation of that individual's schizophrenia complex, as I see it. Yeah, I can't deal with it. It's too threatening. It's too intolerable. The reality here is too intolerable. The reality I'm experiencing in this relationship, the reality it tells me about myself. So I'm going to go right into my complex. Remember what we were saying about complexes before? When you're in one, you can't think straight. Or as Jung said, we talk about having our complexes. Our complexes have us. So that's not a real relationship anyway, is it? It's like, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to do this to that person. No.
And for, what I can imagine, the way you're speaking about, like when this person is engulfed, we'll say, like there's no capacity for relationship. They're not relational at all. And what I really appreciated about you saying that, and then also the clarification of how almost delusional it is to be like, I'm just gonna love through it and I'm gonna fix them, and I could just reach in with my absolute loving awesomeness and I'll just pull them out.
My power.
Exactly. That speaking about this delusional thing, or this kind of delusional way of thinking about it, not to make light of like full on delusions that someone with schizophrenia might be having. Is it clarifies something, which is that my anticipation is that the outcome of that kind of thinking is one or both of two possible ways. One, resentment to the person that you're trying to save, or resentment to yourself for failing to save them, or both.
Both.
And even without this sort of excessive fawning, I'm going to save you response, they're like not recognizing the lack of complete lack of capacity for relational engagement. It might be easy to resent that person, resent that they're not responding to your efforts to care, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
Or resent yourself for failing, right? And the way that you clarified that sort of brought a kind of knowledge to it that allows for this, like, oh, okay, like I'm putting what's the Mike Myers line of like the emphasis is on the wrong syllable or something. It's like, I missed something about the nature of what's happening here that made even a genuine desire to support, either non-functional or dysfunctional to the very thing I was endeavoring to achieve.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Yeah, it's heartbreaking. I mean, not to leave that out of this description we're engaged in, but it's heartbreaking, And so these efforts, the fawning, as you put it, it's an interesting image. That's good. It's not because somebody, of course, is being deliberately inflated or glib. It's I mean, there's a desperation about our usual methods don't apply, you know. So
and there comes that loss of control. Like, I don't know what to do, and I want so deeply to do something that helps this person that I love.
Right. Yeah. So I suppose you toggle back and forth between the things you can think of that make sense in order to restore accessibility, to this person so that you can begin to explore. But so much emotion attached to this situation, as you described. Yeah.
There was something else there that feels like it's slipping away. Maybe it'll come back. So I want to ask you about treatment for schizophrenia, which is, from what I understand, a good portion of cases successful in getting people back to stabilizing in their lives. I'm wondering just generally what your thoughts are with respect to the medication of schizophrenia. Now, before you answer that question, I want to couch it in there being proposed other options for the treatment of schizophrenia based in this kind of premise, this Jungian premise of like, it is the unconscious mind the unconscious has overflowed. It has engulfed the conscious mind. Something a process is activated that they're in. And if they could be supported to finish it, then the waters would naturally recede. This is, I've heard something to this effect, supporting the concept of open dialogue method for the treatment of various psychosis, which I think is in some Scandinavian country, where as a consequence they have extremely low rates of like in or outpatient schizophrenia because of this method being so effective. And it also came up in a previous interview I had with a Jungian psychiatrist, Tim Reed. So with that non-pharmacological treatment option being a potential and medication also being a potential, what are your thoughts on medication versus non-medication therapeutic responses to people who are in or suffering from schizophrenia or schizophrenic episodes?
Well, the first thought I want to put out there is that every case is different. And that's another one of the main points in the book. The image that I always go back to, that idea of the ego needing to be restored enough so that the contents of the unconscious can be integrated, is what would guide me in terms of my assessment of how best to work with someone who has what we call schizophrenia. That being said, this comes up every time we talk about this. I talk about this topic. There's something. There's something compelling and very attractive about the idea. And this is not new. I mean, Lang and Perry, I talk about in the book, but they were two psychiatrists, analysts back in the 1940s, I believe it was. Absolutely. And they wrote a lot, and there are references to what they've written in the book. But basically, they regarded schizophrenia as potentially an experience that could be transformative in terms of one's development, the integration of an inner and outer reality, a mythopoetic journey type of thing. And as much as what you're saying, and I hear this out there, that there are places, indigenous cultures often perceive this state in a different way, and in fact, sometimes hold it in elevated regard. It's like there's a link between shamanism and schizophrenia. It's not the same thing, but you're talking about how we, once again, relate to the world of the unconscious. And honestly, for me, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need medication at all. We would just have, surround the person with community, or, let them be in an environment where they could, feel safe. And then once they were ready and they had one of those islands of clarity, have somebody there who could, be available and guide them, etc. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all situation. And I also remain completely unconvinced that we've got resources like that are readily available for most individuals in this country. So, tried, they're really it. Plus, you've got to take into consideration everything about the individual. And every case, as I said, is so different. You've got, sometimes people have a psychotic episode, as you briefly touched on. Sometimes it's associated with substances, but sometimes it's not. It may be an adjustment phase of some kind, and they come out of it, and then they can make meaning of it, and it's not necessary to medicate, depending upon the supports that are able to be in place for that person during that journey and its duration and everything else that's going on with them. But in my experience, most individuals, the psychotropic meds, the antipsychotic medications that are available now are different from what was around, even 10 years ago. They're getting better. They're not perfect. There's a terrible trade-off. But and when I say trade-off, I'm thinking about like the dimming of affect of one's, lived experience. The juice of life gets mucked around with medication. It's very hard to navigate that. Not impossible. But most individuals, in my impression, medication, the right medication, which is also difficult to find, can help to stabilize the ego enough to where they're available not only for things like therapy, but to make meaning of their own experience. Because otherwise, there's nobody driving the car. It's just not, and it doesn't always, letting it go without reeling someone in one way or another, it doesn't always result in somebody returning to a state of ego stability to where this can be a development instead of a destruction. It just doesn't always work that way. I mean, usually I think the way it happens is if you can get someone on medication, then they become stabilized to where you can begin to work at the meaning of whatever they've experienced. So, and there's a lot of resistance to that. It's easier said than done. This isn't just about saying, oh, okay, here's some medication, here you go, now you're better. Because part of the experience of what we call schizophrenia is, there's a book about it, and the term is Anosognosia, and it's the absolute conviction that there ain't nothing wrong with me. I don't need medication. Do you need medication? Because I'm not taking it, and off we go. And that is part of the whole range of characteristics we call schizophrenia. So it's very difficult. I don't know if I answered your question. I don't have an all or nothing answer because I don't have an all or nothing attitude.
Sure, and it's not, the parameters here are not so clear that a definitive answer can even be attempted reasonably. Your comment at the end there about the what was the term again? Can you repeat it about the?
Yeah, it's Anosognosia. It's Anosognia. I don't know if I got all the syllables in there, but if you Google it, it'll correct your spelling, and that'll be it. And there's a book on it. I don't remember forgive me, the author's name, but he talks about there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need medication. There's nothing wrong with me, and then it's Anosognosia. So,
it reminds me, I've been taking a course recently, and just building my knowledge and skill set around sort of the field of psychedelics. And an aspect of this course was talking about, identifying at what point is psychiatric or medical intervention necessary for somebody who's having a reaction that appears to be, or possibly sort of inclining towards a psychotic episode. And one of the comments that was made was like, if they're asking, am I crazy? That's usually a good sign that they might not be in a full psychosis.
That's
because when they are, there's no question about whether or not
That's right.
I'm crazy. There's absolute conviction that everything that's being experienced is real. I am, well, pardon the light tone here, but I am absolutely Jesus. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that term. In the book, you have a quote here. I'm going to read it. Chronic mental illness certainly is a brain disease, but that explains little, since everything is the brain, not just psychosis, but deeply irrational love for our spouses and children, for example. To end our understanding and inquiry about schizophrenia by defining it as a, quote, brain disease diminishes the other vital dimensions of what makes us human, our perceptions, our emotional intelligence, our souls. That reductive attitude posits that essentially nothing is real unless we can measure it. I'm wondering, with that statement said, what are your thoughts right now on the sort of growing dialogue that I'm assuming you're still sort of like paying attention to how the dialogue around schizophrenia is changing culturally and medically. Do you feel like there is a positive inclination towards the greater sort of acknowledgement of it being a part of the full breadth of potential human experience, or is it still seemingly kind of like narrowed down to like, oh, it seems like the problem here is that your brain is broken, and the brain is a physical organ, it's a physical problem, and we're going to physically fix it with this physical molecule, end all be all said and done? Because even as you described it, get them stable enough that then they can start doing the integration work. I've literally never heard anyone say that their doctor put them on this medication as a way to now help support them doing the therapeutic process of integrating their psychosis. The problem was resolved as soon as they were on the drug because it made the psychosis go away, period, paragraph. I'm wondering what your sort of like take is right now on the sort of like where treatment or understanding of schizophrenia is in that respect.
Well, I can answer in terms of my personal and professional perception. But once again, it's not going to be very satisfied in terms of being definitive. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and, as we Jungians are so fond of saying. I think there are struggles toward a kind of openness to the unconscious and its manifestations in ways that are progressive. Okay. I also think that there's a really firm undergirding of the medical model that still predominates the field of psychiatry and psychology/therapy analysis. I mean, it's not resolved. And, this is not the kind of an issue that I think will lend itself to, okay, well, now we're in a new world. We're going to approach this in a different way. We're going to see little bits of progress. And perhaps, I know this is more your area. It's not mine, the thing about psychedelics. But one way of perceiving that is just that it is an openness to that kind of experience as something that might be potentially redeeming as opposed to destructive. So that's a shift. And it may not be a shift in the way it thinks it's a shift, but I think it may represent a development.
This will be a point of process that I edit out, but can you slide your mic a little bit further away again? It's starting to incline in. I'm getting a lot of what's called plosives.
How about that?
That's much better.
Okay.
Okay. So I might be asking you to maybe just give me one of those both and responses, or maybe to asking you to step out of your wheelhouse here. But I want to get your perspective nonetheless. Something that's quite common topic on the show here, with respect to psychedelics, is the potential threat or of a tangent or sustained psychosis triggered by substances. And the delicate sort of dance of discerning when things that are arising after a psychedelic experience that are very destabilizing in a person, when it is potentially a psychosis and when it is, quote, a spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency, and how to handle the difference, because one of which in some respect would quite legitimately need some sort of medical intervention in order to suppress what's happening, to regain ego function, and so on and so forth, to protect the person from harming themselves. The other needs a kind of support that will help that process flourish and move. So with psychedelics aside, do you have a take on this, on how to tell the difference between what might be a spiritual crisis or emergency that needs caring support and what might be a psychotic episode that needs medical intervention of some kind?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily see those two descriptions of an experience as being mutually exclusive. I think it's probably not. And, part of what you're alluding to isn't the experience itself, it's what we call it. So I don't think I couldn't clearly differentiate between what we call a psychosis and what we call a spiritual crisis, other than through the same ways we question what's going on with somebody that is undergoing what we call schizophrenia, which would be, where's the ego functioning? Is there, how much ego stability is there? Because whether it's a psychosis or a spiritual crisis, it's going to require similar kinds of guidance, bracketing, helping us to find that sandbar again, and then it's a matter of how we choose to or are able to find meaning in this experience. So
that's great. That's a beautiful answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
So let's slide into home plate here. I have what I'd like to end. I'd like to end on something really practical for people. I mean, everything we've talked about here is practical because it helps with a mindset shift. And when the mindset shifts, it creates possibility spaces that weren't possible before with respect to how we engage ourselves, relationally with others who have or have had or in the midst of schizophrenia or schizophrenic episodes, strangers, loved ones, etc. But I want to get super practical here in the sense of what is your personal not personal advice, I guess, a piece of advice you'd have for people in three different positions. And I'm going to ask each of the three positions separately. And the first one is, as a psychologist, what piece of advice would you offer other practitioners who are now or about to work with someone who has schizophrenia?
Okay, I'm going to do these one by one. That's good, because then I won't have to remember all three. Okay.
Yes.
I would encourage a curious attitude, and psychologists are not they're not free of complexes, obviously, right? So I think even in the Jungian community, honestly, my impression, there's a lot of stigma still associated with this topic. There are a lot of analysts who bicker, about whether Jung had psychosis or not. Who cares? I mean, honestly, he had what we might call a psychotic experience, and the gold there is the fact that he didn't stay there, and he came back, and he demonstrated with his own life and his creative writing and art how such a process might take place. So, we don't all need to be Jungian analysts. We don't all need to be psychologists. So my hope would be for the professional community what it is for everybody else, which is that we question our prevailing hardwired attitudes about what we call schizophrenia and open it up and remember Eros. in our encounters and in, our decisions. I don't know if that.
Can you clarify? Just, I think, remember eros, just a disambiguation there. Remember eros
Sure.
is in like, remember what exactly?
Well, Eros is the Greek god of relatedness. So it's not just the guy with Cupid with the bow. It's the idea of love writ large. It's the juice that makes life worth living. It's love in all its manifestations. It could even be creative endeavors, but Eros helps us to soften into an attitude of acceptance and inclusion. And I think if we start with that, then anything that falls into place with regard to the details of how we deal with this, if it's medication, if it's therapy, if it's what kind of therapy, if it's doing our own red books, I mean, anything that we do, if it is held by this attitude, then I think that gives us the best possible chance of making some kind of positive change.
Thank you. So here's the next one, the next scenario. As somebody who is in the industry and has had a chance to see where things are seemingly going in a good direction, led by Eros, and still staying in this sort of regressive, in this regressive place, or stigmatized, or we'll say willing or unwilling ignorance with respect to schizophrenia. What advice would you offer someone with the condition who is now like grappling with the schizophrenia complex of recognizing the impact of having, okay, now they're diagnosed, they just got their ego function back. Maybe they're medicated, maybe they're not, but they're in that either fresh or recently fresh sort of like zone of making sense of this now and are looking for support, knowing now, listening, that they're not necessarily going to find good support just by going to see whatever psychiatrist is available through their family doctor. What piece of advice would you offer them?
Well, I think it's very encouraging that in this imaginary case you're describing, the person has restored enough ego consolidation to where they can begin to get a little objectivity about their experience, restore their affect, and then, yes, terribly uncomfortable. That's when they would have what we might call a schizophrenia complex, if it's intolerable, the feelings of shame or whatever else is going on in response to their recognition about what they've been through. But my hope would be, in a situation like that, just with any other, that this person needs help and they need to reach out. So there needs to be some amenability to relatedness. Now, depending upon how many of this person's relationships have been severed as a result of what they've been through, that's certainly a factor. But if they have family or are able to have friends or are able to, the same like stable factors that we would say for anyone, your work, your relationships, your health, your ability to care for yourself, even your transportation. I mean, all those basics, if they are in place, they need to be encouraged. So even therapy at that stage is going to have it's going to probably need to really focus on just those very ego-conscious kinds of goals. And that's the frame in which at some point, as you and I have both been saying, we would like to see them be able to make some meaning of the experience. But they're not there yet. You can't just plunge right in and you're not going to be doing any kind of an in-depth analysis with somebody who's just come out of what we describe as a psychosis. No. They need that all of the support needs to be around creating the scaffolding. And sometimes that's as far as you get for an unpredictable length of time. So the same kinds of supports, but here again, just like with anyone, it's not a one size fits all with regard to therapy, is it? I mean, different strokes for different folks. I mean, there are people that are a good fit and people that aren't. And so if I had the opportunity to give the person some console, I would say, do an interview, do some you do your research, see who meets your needs. I would I would hope they'd be feeling good enough about themselves that they're going to do some sorting, because there's, as you pointed out, there's a pretty wide range of different kinds of treatment and therapy. Well, they get to choose, and if they could be empowered to do that, I think that would be a wonderful first step. Often it's not somebody's stated background or what they know intellectually, it's a heart connection, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about relatedness, and that is the foundation of all the other stuff that we might discover through a treatment.
Yeah, I thought of what's his name, Alan Shore. The sort of like, I think he called it the art of psychotherapy. That sort of like right brain, person to person attunement being more important than what a person intellectually understands about their practice. That's an aside. Anyone listening, Alan Shore's great. So this is the third one and the final one before closing.
Okay.
As a mother of someone who has schizophrenia and went through a difficult journey engulfed by the unconscious, what piece of advice would you offer us generally with respect to remaining supportive in our relationships with those who have schizophrenia, theoretically, while they're like in it, like they're gripped by it, but also afterwards?
Boy, I wish there was a one clear direction on that one. You do the best you can. You hold on to your love. You let love guide you. You try to notice when you're responding from fear or judgment or a sense of stigma or shame. You let the truth be okay about what is going on with this loved one that you see undergoing something you cannot control. I mean, I was determined to do everything I could. Part of that we could describe in the realm of the Great Mother Complex, but a lot of it wasn't. It was just plain, I'm going to do everything I can. So in my son's case, he was unique, and just like all cases are unique, he held on to a bit of relatedness no matter what. His islands of clarity would emerge when he was confronted by me, by his family, and he would show up, answer questions, be right. I mean, so he was able to do that in his case. I don't think that's everybody, but in our case, so I mean, the general application of that, I suppose, would be deal with the reality of whatever presents itself, not your expectations, not your projections, if possible, but just this person whom you love. And as a mother, it's unconditional, is my way of experiencing it and describing it. So you love the person that this person is in that moment. It's a journey for all of us. And part of the journey is one that occurs on a good day, even if you're not dealing with schizophrenia, which is to accept the reality of our circumstances and differentiate that from the hopes, dreams, and ideal images we had of what our lives were going to look like and what this person was going to be like. Because psyche is confronting us with a different reality. And the sooner we can lean into that for ourselves and hold on to our love for this person, then the decisions fall into place. And everybody's different. I mean, I made many trips up to Venice Beach. I don't know if I describe it in the book, but it's like a motley beach community, if we can say, sort of a cross between Coney Island and Tijuana was one of the things. It's sort of indescribable, which is why I'm struggling to come up with images. But he landed in Venice Beach, and this was a sort of a mother lode for individuals who are having experiences with the unconscious. We'll put it that way. And I just went there. It's a drive away, but I would drive up there, and I would and he would sometimes offer to meet with me, with family, and we would go. And we would show up, and we would give him enough support to make sure he was safe, but he had to be in charge of his own journey at that point, and so we kept tabs on him in that way. So you're navigating between what appears practical and safe, and absolutely holding on to that, but there has to be a certain objectivity in how you handle it, because it's potentially so overwhelming emotionally for a mother, for a caring other, so we have to really, it's not just about how we navigate what's going on with them, it's how we navigate what's going on with us, so. And
And I
then it
guess,
was slow. And then it was, and I knew, wouldn't it be lovely if we could have found one of those little guarded communities where he could have played? That was not, first of all, it wouldn't have fit his personality. So it meant, really hanging in there with him and being there when he was ready to come. And he did. And he's independent now, but it's not. It's just a long journey, and the commitment has to be to the love, I think.
and I guess that remains, afterwards in the integration, like the integration period and the living with it period. And I assume the sort of like what I feel into, and I feel as a fair sort of, concern, is this sort of this background low simmer of fear that it's going to happen again. And sort of like this, how did you describe it? This sort of accepting the reality that you can't control it, or something to this effect, and like staying in the love. Yeah.
Well, and it's true not just of that person, but in terms of our relationship with the unconscious, because ultimately we can't control that either. I mean, we don't know if that person is going to go back, and he's not going to go back. Nobody goes back to what they were before. You can't. But, could something unsettling happen again? Just to that person? How about to all of us? So that's a reality in terms of our vulnerability before the unconscious. That is universal. It doesn't just have to do with how we regard individuals with what we call schizophrenia. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Dr. Eve Maram, thank you for this conversation, and thank you for, putting yourself out on the line, your heart on the line, to stand for something that you felt was meaningful, which is to, lean into acknowledging people with this condition as not being, I don't know, like wrong or broken, but to open your heart to this. Because as you sort of mentioned a little bit, it's my anticipation is that it has not gone exclusively positive. And you probably got a lot of, a lot of pushback, a lot of stigma, a lot of stuff. And so I appreciate that you put yourself on the line for this, because it's, to me, I experience it as very meaningful and positive. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much for being here with me. It's been lovely.
Just as the final piece, where do people follow up if they want to read your book, The Schizophrenia Complex? You have a previous book as well about psychopathy, yes. I believe.
Yes.
I don't know how active you are on social media, but what are the links you'd like to leave people with if they want to follow up more fully with your work?
If you just Google Eve Maram, then my website will show up. There are a bunch of websites, and certainly the book's on Amazon, as well as Chiron, which is the publisher. And and there are ways to contact me that are also easy access online just by Googling my name.
Excellent. I'll make sure links to all of that are in the description to this episode, wherever people are checking it out. Dr. Maram, thank you again.
Thank you, James.
And cut. Okay, that's all for this episode. If you like what you heard here from Dr. Eve Maram, you could check out her book, The Schizophrenia Complex, which I'm holding up on the screen here on YouTube, or her other book, Psychopathy Within. Links to purchasing her books will be in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Furthermore, if you're finding value in the show and you would like to contribute to its production, or contribute to the larger body of work that I produce, of which this podcast is one of or part of, you can become my patron on Patreon, a paid member, by heading to patreon.com/JamesWJesso, where the tier at which you pledge to be a member influences the kind of benefits you will get as a member. You could also follow me on Patreon without paying, and you'll stay up to date on what I'm releasing. You just won't have access to certain things that are for paid patrons only. You could also follow me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, what's it called now? At James W. Jesso. Or you can follow me on Telegram. I have a Telegram channel where I basically just showcase things that I think are interesting or things that I produced. And it's a one directional channel. So if you find Telegram can get bogged down by a lot of back and forth, my Telegram channel is not like that. And finally, you can sign up for my newsletter. That would be kind of the best, I guess, because that's the most direct way and on the platform that generally we all have, which is email. And I tend to send out a digest of the things that I've been producing over the past month, once a month, and then occasionally some special emails that pertain to special events that are happening for me or special offers that I have for you as people in my newsletter list. So yeah, Patreon, social media, Telegram, or newsletter. Or you could just follow me here on YouTube if that's where you are. That's all. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. And I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.